Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to Real Estate Coaching Radio, America's #1 trusted resource for realtors who demand authentic, real-time coaching. Starring award-winning real estate coaches Tim and Julie Harris. Get ready for unfiltered, full-strength honesty about what is truly working to get you into action and make you money in this new real estate boom. Now to our hosts, Tim and Julie Harris.
And welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to Real Estate Coaching Radio. We are joined today by Jonathan Smoke, the Chief Economist for Realtor.com, the official site of the National Association of Realtors. Smoke is a 20-year veteran of the real estate industry and has held a number of executive roles throughout the industry. Prior to working for Realtor.com, he served in key executive roles for Hanley Wood, an information and marketing services company serving the residential, commercial, design, and construction industries. He's also an entrepreneur with business ownership and consulting experience and has a master's in business administration from the University of Texas at Austin. He joins us today to discuss the August and September National Housing Trend Reports. We're going to go over some of the autumn 2014 housing trends that are happening right now, and he's going to help us keep up with today's changing real estate marketplace. So let's now welcome Jonathan Smoke as we join our host, Tim Harris.
So, Jonathan, first of all, welcome back to Real Estate Coaching Radio. I really enjoyed our first co-hosting venture that we did a couple months ago, and I'm looking forward to this one too. And, man, have a lot of things changed in the last couple months. What things popped to mind as being the most, I'd say, surprising? Anything surprising in the housing scene in the last couple months you want to share with the listeners?
Well, thanks for having me back, Tim. But is this first proof that your audience can handle a little dose of economics on a periodic basis?
Exactly. You caught me midstream drinking coffee. Yes.
Yeah. So since we talked last in August, we've seen solid progress in the economic recovery and continued year-over-year improvement in housing. We now have the benefit of looking at both August and September data. And even today, the initial GDP estimate for the third quarter came out, and it was 3.5% growth, where analysts were expecting only 3%. And that's a perfect summary of the economic data and performance we've seen in August and September. Almost to a metric, the economy is finally starting to fire on all cylinders. Employment growth this year is looking to be the best year we've seen since 2000. And we're really seeing it across all sectors of the economy. Manufacturing, services, retail, and construction are all reporting growth. So, of course, on the housing front, you would expect us to be seeing improvement with all those fundamentals improving. And we're seeing it in the form of the pace of existing home sales and in other data points. Now, in August, the National Association of Realtors reported that existing home sales dipped slightly, but then in September had more of an increase than the August decline. So from a pace perspective, the quarter was continuing to be up quarter over quarter and, of course, year over year. We are seeing total numbers, though, a bit beneath last year, but really I encourage people to look at the composition of those sales because they have improved dramatically. So, for example, if you factor out distressed sales, the foreclosures and the short sales, and you just look at the normal sales, then September was actually up 2.5% year over year.
Well, we're also seeing the return to normal types of transactions, right? So not so much investor activity. We're seeing normal buyers and sellers enter the market. We're seeing first-time buyers come back in. We're seeing move-up buyers. We're seeing downsizers. We're seeing, as you and I predicted a couple months ago, we're seeing a return to a market that will inevitably be a ever-increasing, and I'll call it a real estate boom that will happen over the next 7 to 10 years. So listeners, everything that Jonathan and I are sharing with you so far is optimistic, that you should be cheering about. Now, we're going to get to a couple of potential headwinds here in a second that might put some of you back on your heels. But at this point, all of you should be loving the fact that you're realtors and you're in the right place in the right time, and our industry is probably going to be one of the fastest growing sectors in the economy over the next decade. So, Jonathan, go ahead. Sorry.
And make sure you reinforce the point that we are returning to normal and that distress is down. Because if we could have only asked for one thing to improve this year, losing the distress, I think would have been it. And as we've been hearing Ariana Grande sing all summer long, I got one less problem without you.
Right.
So that's a good thing to have.
Well, and yeah, I mean, there's reports that are coming out every month that they're saying essentially the number of distressed properties, because guys, obviously, naturally, the home values are starting to increase. It's taking a lot fewer people are underwater, and so it's all, for the most part, in most of the country, you guys are seeing the markets in some cases dramatically improve. In other cases, you're starting to see them slowly improve. But the bottom line is at least they're not going the other way. I mean, it wasn't so long ago that we were hearing month-over-month reports of things worsening, and now we're definitely on an upswing, and the improving market finally has momentum. It was even a little dicey at the beginning of the year, but now there's no question as we roll into 2015 that, there might be some ebbs and flows, but for the most part, this is really going to be the continuation of a really great housing recovery. Now, there is some headwinds that might potentially slow things down, or at least give the market a moment to pause. And one of those headwinds, and Jonathan and I were talking about this prior to today's show, was in the form of an announcement from Janet Yellen yesterday saying that QE is over. No more buying of bonds, the $4 trillion in mostly mortgage-backed securities that the Fed's been investing in. They're not buying those anymore. So there's reasons to believe that there is going to be an increasing interest rate environment. And the question is when. So, Jonathan, you're the economist. Pick up there and correct me if I said anything wrong.
No, you got it right. So basically the Fed has had two tools in their arsenal. The first and the more traditional one is simply what they do with the federal funds rate. But when they took that all the way to zero back when the housing crisis first began, they really had nothing left that they could do, and so they invented this concept of quantitative easing, and we've gone through now three rounds of it. But they stuck to their word. They said they were going to taper that off. In fact, it was the fear of the taper last summer that led mortgage rates, starting in May, to jump. Then when they actually started the taper and cutting back on their bond purchases last September, that's when we actually saw mortgage rates go back down a little bit. But now we've worked completely through that process. This is the last month that they're doing those bond purchases. But in the short term, on the rate side, they've said that they intend to keep rates where they are, and mainly that's because we've yet to see inflation pose any sort of threat, and they still see slack on the employment side of things, meaning we're not quite to the unemployment targets, and labor participation has been down low. Most of the analysts that cover the space, from economists to folks on Wall Street and people in the bond market, essentially it's the big question is when. When will we see the federal funds rate tick up a quarter point? And the bets kind of range from early in the spring to late in 2015 to possibly as late as early 2016. So it's simply become a question of when, not if, the rates will go up. And just like we had with the fear of the taper, the same situation is going to play out now. So meaning the market is going to anticipate and the interest rate activity happening, and the effect will be mortgage rates will go up before the Fed actually acts. So my best guess at this point is that we will see mortgage rates go up sometime in the middle part of next year. We probably will not see a substantial increase. It's likely to be something like 50 basis points that we will see mortgage rates move within the next year. But it does lead you to the absolute perspective that if your potential client is thinking about selling and buying, or just simply buying, that the one thing we can hold true is that within the next year we're going to have both higher prices and higher rates. So if they have access to credit today and they have the down payment and they can find that home of their dreams, now is the time to act, to take advantage of those rates.
Yeah, there's no question we're going to be looking. I mean, I remember Julie and I were in our early 20s. We bought our first house, and the interest rate was 7%. People were, like, congratulating us on the low interest rate, you know. I mean, so there's no question that going forward, this is going to be seen as probably the best time in the next 30 years to have secured long-term financing on a house. I mean, the rates in the 4s and the 3s, kind of crazy. So I know a lot of you guys are getting the seasonal type objections. Yeah, we're going to wait until the spring from sellers. Or we're going to wait until the spring from the buyers. You might want to share with them this information so that they can have all the information that they need before making a decision. You know, from a seller's perspective, yeah, they don't want to be hassled during the holidays. Makes sense. But maybe the sellers need to be taking into consideration the fact that if they're buying something, the interest rates increase, they aren't going to necessarily be able to afford what they've otherwise wanted to afford. And the other side to it is there might be fewer buyers, depending on what the rates increase to. That could take buyers out of the market because obviously fewer people will be able to afford homes. I mean, so these are all the balls that are being juggled right now that no one really knows how they're all going to, you know, end up being caught, and inevitably a lot of them won't be. So, you know, inform your clients, be informed yourself so that you can help them make the right decisions. Because, you know, honestly, as Jonathan just alluded to, now probably is the best damn time to be putting your house for sale and buying something, and not next year. You know, so just keep all those things in mind. So we're seeing a slowdown. We hear this from all of our coaching clients across the country, that they're reporting a slowdown in the fall. Any reason to believe this is anything other than just the normal autumnal, you know, end of the year seasonal slowdown?
Oh, yeah, it's pure seasonality. So listings did decline in August and September, but they do typically decline starting in August. But what's interesting about this year are a couple of things, one of which is we've yet to see the median list price decline because pricing has a seasonal pattern to it, and normally you see listings and median list prices decline. And consistent with the pricing holding steady, the median age of inventory is continuing to decline year over year. So that tells us that all that we're seeing today is pure seasonality, but relative to prior years and especially relative to last year, the market is tighter and is favoring sellers in the condition that we're in. And again, that pattern's held true in both August and September.
So let's touch on some of the macro trends that you guys read about in the August National Housing Trend Report. A lot of focus was on the millennials in that August report, and then September the trend was tech-heavy industries and baby boomers. Can you tell us how you picked those topics? Share with the listeners some of the little pieces of information that you guys discovered that maybe our listeners wouldn't have normally thought of or known about?
Well, sure. I basically don't like just printing numbers in a table. I like to tell a story with the data to help folks understand what's going on. So with the August numbers, we focused on millennials. Millennials are a hot topic and likely to be for, honestly, Tim, at least for you and I, for the rest of our lifetime, given their size. And so we decided to focus in July on affordable markets where inventory was solid and better than last year to enable millennials to purchase their first home if they can qualify for a mortgage. Then with the September data, we couldn't help but bring attention to the fastest moving markets because there's quite a bit of variation in terms of several metrics, but the median days on market is pretty significantly different. And so we focused on the markets where that age of inventory was under 60 days. And among several trends we found that those markets had in common was quite simply that they are opportunity magnets. They're particularly strong in engineering and tech-oriented jobs, and they also happen to have very large numbers of baby boomers who live there today. And baby boomers have been driving more of the activity than other generations so far in this recovery.
Well, so you just touched on a whole bunch of things. My mind's going in a bunch of different directions. So the baby boomers have been driving the recovery. In other words, the youngest baby boomer now is what, 53, something like that?
Yes. So the last baby boomer turns 55 by 2019.
Okay, so we're still the biggest segment of the housing transactions basically is from those guys moving up and those guys moving down, essentially. But maybe the listeners don't know this. The millennials, they are children in essence. The number of millennials to the number of baby boomers, isn't it like 3 to 4 to 1? In other words, isn't that group of people so much larger than even their parents? I don't remember the exact numbers. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so, and in fact, for all your listeners that happen to be going to New Orleans next week, come to the Realtor University session on Sunday morning that's on consumer preferences and trends, because I'll be a part of that and presenting specifically on millennials. So I've been doing a deep dive on those folks. That crowd is, the millennials, is roughly about 90 million, by far the largest generation, and yes, they do dwarf the boomers, but they are just now in that period of forming households, so they make up a tiny fraction of homeowners today. They make a tiny fraction of households, and of course their home ownership rate has been low, and even low by historical standards, because of they came of age essentially at the wrong time. But we know today that the biggest factor that's not normal in today's market is the percentage of first-time buyers. And by my calculations, millennials make up about 60% of what we call first-time buyers. So you do have older households. You do have some, in fact, like immigration-driven purchases that are households that are older than millennials. But by far, when we talk about a lack of a first-time market, it's principally millennials today. And that's been a function of both limited supply, so those affordable homes that they could have been buying over the last couple of years were instead bought up by big investment firms and turned into rentals. But it's also very much what I would describe as overly tight credit conditions. And to quantify this, I would estimate that we would have at least 15% more sales this year if credit conditions were back to more normal standards.
Did you hear the little news blurb that Ben Bernanke got turned down for a mortgage refi?
Absolutely, and that's like the perfect poster child for what it's meant to have these tight standards. The standard issue is basically one that has to do with every part of the qualification requirements being too tight, and that's a reflection of what the banks have been referring to as putback risk. Essentially, while the QM standards, the qualified mortgage standards, were being drafted, they basically had an initial set of standards. So like the debt-to-income ratios and the loan-to-income ratios and the minimal credit score. So to avoid any chance of those standards coming back to haunt them with mortgages several years down the road, banks have basically added overlays, buffers, and more or less it means they were trying to find every reason not to lend, and that's not to their discredit. They were trying to kind of control the risk, but the reality is even Ben Bernanke couldn't qualify for a refi on his home, and we all know that he has the income to be able to handle
well, we hope, right?
Be a low-risk investment.
Well, so overlays, guys, what that means is basically Fannie, Freddie, right, whoever's, insuring the mortgage, has standards, but what the banks are doing is they're putting an overlay on top of that. So they're putting their own rules for qualification on top of the conventional, standards, and that's causing a lot of people not to qualify, and absolutely, it makes sense. That's preventing a lot of what would have been first-time buyers purchasing homes. But, it's interesting, Jonathan, there's a lot of well-meaning sort of quasi-housing reporters that are talking about the fact that they are theorizing that millennials won't have the same appetite for housing as the previous generation. Are we seeing any real evidence of that other than what, we're sort of talking about now?
No, I'll just tease with a little bit of what I'm going to be speaking about at the convention. I think that conventional story is completely wrong. What you basically see is that millennials have attitudes about housing that are as strong as any other generation. So they, when you ask them to describe the American dream, owning a home is part of that. When you ask them to describe how they think they'll live in 20 years, it's absolutely the same kind of scenario that we've all described. It's just they have had a few impediments. Number one, they had a much higher unemployment rate. So when you break down unemployment by ages, it was the millennials that suffered the most during the recession. And again, they were just coming out of college. The oldest ones were coming out of college right as the recession unfolded. That caused them to retreat and do the rational thing and go back to school and or move back with mom and dad. And so there's been a ton of what I would say is noise today talking about how, this is a forever different shift. They are going to prefer to rent. They want to share everything. They won't want to own a home. And the reality is, number one, they are just like the rest of us with regards to life. And so they will be going through life events. Maybe they got a slightly later start than the rest of us. But, for example, I'm going to be showing recent birth statistics, and I'm pretty confident that boomers are not a part of the birth explosion that seems to be going on right now. And I think, the old line, baby needs a new pair of shoes. Well, she also needs a room of her own. And living in mom and dad's basement or living with 2 or 3 other people in an apartment just isn't going to cut it. And in fact, if you look at millennial patterns across the country, what you really see is that their homeownership rate and their attitudes towards renting are really based on where they live. So if you're in the high-cost areas of New York or Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, San Francisco, Silicon Valley, then yes, they have incredibly low homeownership rates. But they are also in extremely large numbers everywhere else. And in fact, their homeownership varies from being above the national norm to being extremely low in places like New York. And I think what we're going to see, or what we're already seeing unfolding potentially this year, is that millennials are looking. And there's no doubt from our data from web traffic and what they're doing that millennials are looking at real estate. I'll share one statistic that I love the most. All summer long, starting in June and through the month of September, because we don't have October complete numbers yet, half of all adults aged 21 to 34, so it's most of the post-college millennials, have looked at real estate online every single month. Now, that doesn't mean
awesome.
They're actively shopping, but they are very much plugged in and interested in this world. And, oh, by the way, 86% of them say they intend to use a realtor when it's time for them to buy.
Yeah, well, what I'm thinking about is if I were in that age group and I were looking for a career path, it would make a hell of a lot of sense for me to get my real estate license and sell to my peers. That's like a no-brainer opportunity. So age group-wise, so the millennials are as young as right now? What's the youngest?
The youngest millennial today is 13. The youngest is 13.
Okay. And the oldest one, you said, is basically in the mid-30s.
Yes, that's right.
Mid-30s. Okay,
that's
so
right.
And there's 90 million of these guys, basically.
Yes.
90 million.
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. So this is a trend that's going to be lasting. Obviously, they're going to be directing not just housing trends, but automotive trends, fashion trends, music trends, color trends, communication trends. I mean, when those people start really coming to, and I assume it's like the baby boomers where essentially there's the fewest of the oldest and it gets bigger like a mushroom. Is that correct?
Oh, actually, it's a little bit more of an even shape. They didn't quite have the distribution that the boomers did. I'm actually going to be talking about that data. But I think the chart, when you look at the year of births over time, it's the most optimistic long-term chart of why you should be in real estate that you could ever ask for. Because Generation Y, the millennials, are the biggest generation we've ever had. But Generation Z, who we're still making, because there's only 12 years of them so far, is on pace to be even bigger than the millennials. So in other words, the pain that we've been going through is sort of related to our generation, Tim.
Yeah,
the Gen Xers.
Generation X. Yeah. Yeah, I know. It's
Blame
true.
It
I mean,
on
most of the people that I went to high school with are really, they're still back on their heels. And I communicate with these guys through Facebook and whatever, and a lot of them are still suffering from negative equity, or they overreached when they're investing in real estate. Yeah. So it's our generation, I think, that's always been forgotten about and will probably continue to be forgotten about, but such is the way. So I'm out there as a realtor, and I'm somewhere, in the United States. I'm listening to this interview. I'm listening to these sort of big macro trends. I'm thinking about how I can actually apply this information to my business today. I heard something about, I'm feeling optimistic. I'm realizing that I am in the right industry. I'm realizing the fact that my industry is poised to have explosive, unprecedented growth, certainly reaching beyond my normal career lifespan. So what should I be doing now? From an economist perspective, where should my focus be?
Well, so inventory is tight today, right? And we really don't see that dramatically changing going forward. Interest, like I mentioned with millennials, but by the way, Gen Xers are not far behind, and boomers are just a bit behind them. But they're all looking at real estate. You can tell that there's pent-up demand just on the way that the website behavior. So I would say timeliness is important, because if we have tight supply and all of these people interested, then you're going to continue to see the kind of trending down in age of inventory that we've experienced. And as we were discussing earlier, it is a near certainty that both prices and mortgage rates will be higher next year. So would-be buyers will be intently looking, because they're rational. They understand this kind of once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And along that line, and very similar to something you said earlier, Tim, I would say that it's a great time to encourage listing off-season, or even at least listing earlier next year than people typically wouldn't, because an enormous portion of that missing first-time buyer segment, that if indeed some of these improvements in opening up credit take place early next year, they don't have school-age children quite yet. So they're not quite beholden to the school year the way we traditionally kind of let the market follow that. And I think that's an enormous opportunity. But bottom line, know your market, be aware of the demographics and these generational trends. To know the millennials, they're going to be driving us. So yes, you should know who Ariana Grande is, and potentially even have Taylor Swift's album, even if that might kill you. And know how to speak to these folks, because they're going to be a dominant force once they really enter the market big time.
Well, so let's talk about, you're talking about market trends and knowing your market, because that's kind of where my mind was going too, right? I mean, even I always think back when Julie and I were selling real estate in Columbus, Ohio. And Columbus has never been and never probably will be a first-tier real estate market, in the sense that it's not, the home appreciation there, it happens in pockets. It's not something that happens like in, California or Arizona or Austin, for example. It's just nice, steady, keeps up with inflation, generally speaking. But even in Columbus, there were markets. Like I remember when we were selling real estate, German Village was really hot, and then there'd be these trendy little bubbles up. There'd be certain streets, and then there'd be this new subdivision. So even in a normal market, like where Julie and I basically cut our teeth, there always are going to be opportunities. And so be opportunistic when you're selling real estate. It does make sense, and pay attention to the trends. You guys should know that a lot of times, upper-end buyers, they'll move to trendy neighborhoods. Thinking back to Columbus, Ohio, I remember Muirfield for a long time was the trendy neighborhood in the 70s and 80s, and all of a sudden Les Wexner, decided to develop New Albany. And so a lot of the, herd leaders from Muirfield moved out to New Albany, and then, all these types of little micro trends that happen in your marketplace. You guys really have to, as Jonathan said, deep dive into your own MLS to know what's really going on, so you can make the most of this really fantastic housing recovery. And if you're not experiencing that, if you're not feeling like the winds are at your back, it's probably because you're not taking seriously the opportunity, or maybe I'm not using the right word when I say taking seriously, but you're not seeing the opportunity and then not exploring where the opportunity is for you in your particular market. But, let's talk about the best and the worst areas in the country, the information you're getting from the statistics from searching on Realtor.com. What are you seeing? Any particular markets that are just kind of flat or depreciating or maybe not recovering as quick versus the others? Anything comes to mind when I ask that question?
Sure. So looking across the country and all the major markets, so the big markets that people would recognize that have the largest population centers, the government classifies 366, for example, as metropolitan statistical areas. Only about 10% of them are not looking like they are in full recovery mode. And what I mean by that is, are they seeing improvements in multiple metrics that are, classically tied to good conditions? So declines in unemployment, increase in employment, good data that feeds into GDP calculations, and our home prices improving in those markets. Of those ones that are not quite moving in the right direction today, they tend to be small markets and small markets that are susceptible to individual local issues. So just looking at that short list, for example, 2 markets that happen to be in Georgia pop out. And some listeners may actually see the data that actually the state of Georgia has the highest unemployment rate in the country today. And we're not used to seeing the high-growth southeastern part of the United States in that category. But, for example, Warner Robins, Georgia, and Albany, Georgia, both have had to deal with big declines in government and government-related jobs that were essentially a result of the sequestration and the efforts to cut back on the government's budget last year. But that aside, let's focus on the best performing markets. There are 60 that are not just in recovery mode, they are in what economists call expansion mode, because every month they are basically setting new highs in those critical metrics like jobs and home prices, and even in areas like new construction. Texas is well represented in that group. It seems like Texas has been the one bright star for years now. And so clearly markets like Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, San Antonio all fit in that bucket. But we're also seeing other states with several markets on the list, North Dakota, Colorado, Utah, and then just a mixture of markets that are basically high population growth opportunity magnets like Raleigh, Durham, Nashville, for example, and of course some classic major California markets. And in fact, the list of the markets that are in expansion mode tend to be large markets. And so there's clearly a lot of opportunities for the listeners there, the likes of Houston, Dallas, Washington, D.C., the entire San Francisco Bay, Silicon Valley area, San Diego. And, of course, that brings us right back to the markets we were highlighting with the September data of, these are the markets that are incredibly tight from an inventory perspective, and inventory is moving pretty quickly.
Again, getting back to knowing your own market statistics, and that's where we're seeing the new builders enter back into the market in those same markets, and certainly all over Texas. It's dotted with, and our own, Julie and I live just north of Austin, and there were, 12 months ago, they announced that there was going to be 7,800 new homes that are going to get built here, and it's like, that's incredible, and if you're selling real estate in this market and you're not aware of that, and you're listing resale homes, that's going to be a real interesting, experience trying to explain to the seller that you hadn't prepared why their house isn't selling because it's having to compete against new construction. And also, you guys might want to consider aligning yourself with some of these builders, befriending the build reps, getting their resale referrals. I mean, there's so many opportunities. It's mind-boggling. I'm curious, though, from looking at the data, any anomalies in terms of the recovery, any head-scratchers in terms of the data, things that you just looked at and said, well, that doesn't even make sense in terms just from the traditional standpoint?
Well, not really, and I'm extremely thankful for that because we've gone through years of head-scratching, things not making sense, and it's now more classic supply and demand. The only thing that I scratched my head at in September was the fact that Omaha and Palm Bay, Florida, were listed alongside some of these extremely large, well-known, heated markets. But then when I dove into, I was essentially looking at what could you possibly make Omaha similar to Dallas-Fort Worth and to Washington, D.C. and San Francisco, and the same was true for Palm Bay. And again, it's these interesting patterns like, well, all of those markets have a large number of engineering and tech-related jobs, and that's an area of the economy that's been particularly strong. And all of those markets had extremely high numbers of boomers. So boomers dominate everywhere today, but those markets in particular had even more boomers. And since boomers are the ones approaching retirement year, life events, final child moving out perhaps for the second or third time, thinking of the dream home and finally having the money to do it, or thinking about what they want to do for retirement, or even investing in second homes, that's why you're seeing the activity in these markets being so strong.
So it sounds to me like what's happening is a sort of bifurcation of housing, and well, maybe I shouldn't say it that way, but of the country almost. There's areas that are recovering at a very rapid pace, and some that maybe just aren't doing so well, and they're following the sort of predictable demographic trends that's following, the people are moving to where the jobs are. I mean, all these sort of make sense things. But is there going to be a marketable disparity between the sort of housing haves and have-nots going forward? Do you think that's going to be something that's going to be more pronounced than maybe we're giving it credit for?
Well, I do think you're going to see a lot more variability than we had, for example, in the boom when basically everything was booming, and then in the bust when the credit crisis just about killed everything, including the economy. So you are seeing markets kind of exert their attraction and their advantages, and a lot of it fundamentally, more than anything else in housing, has to do with jobs. And so that's also the clue as to where you're going to see the millennials really buying is going to be related to where the hiring of millennials is really ramping up. And so you're going to see that attraction, but then you're going to get the classic examples of, okay, does that mean that only everybody in the country wants to live in Silicon Valley, for example? Well, the downside to the Silicon Valley is affordability, and there's extremely low opportunities for new construction, new development to keep pace with that. So it presents then opportunities for other areas to become the new attractive hotspots. And indeed, for example, the classic story of Austin. Austin basically became a tech hotbed when California became too expensive and too attractive. And I think you're going to continue to see those sorts of dynamics play out across the country. And the one area that potentially suffers the most in that mix, you can generically say, is more the Northeast and the Midwest, the older markets. But then there are huge exceptions in that bucket. Like one of the biggest, hottest markets today is Pittsburgh. When I was growing up, Pittsburgh never kind of jumped out of your mind as a place that was glamorous and awesome for young people and opportunity. But that's the kind of economic and demographic transformation that Pittsburgh's been going through. So I think you'll see that. You're going to see the battle of markets to attract businesses and attract people, and ultimately real estate's best where you have population and household growth, and all of that follows jobs.
So from an investment perspective, listeners, I am taking away from what I'm hearing Mr. Smoke say two things. Obviously, if you're selling real estate in one of those markets, and you can get it. By the way, Jonathan, the Trends Report, how can our listeners get a copy of that?
It's on Realtor.com in the Real Estate Trends section, which you can just go to the news category and find that easily.
Actually, listeners, what I'll do is make it easier on you. Most of you listen in replay, so what we'll do is, Mr. Producer, I know you're listening, let's include a link in the description of the show so these guys can just click on the link and go right to Realtor.com site and read the report. So there's that, right? I mean, you have to know your market statistics. You have to know it for the sake of being a professional, for advising your buyers and your sellers and whatnot. But I'll tell you where my mind is also going is if you're personally investing in real estate, well, doesn't it make sense to invest in real estate where you're going to have population growth and hypothetically increase in your asset price? So, I mean, there's so much power with knowing this type of information. And Jonathan, I really appreciate you being my co-host today, and I'm going to hope to have you back again next month, if not sooner.
You bet, Tim. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, listeners, and we'll talk with you tomorrow. Remember, your homework, we'll talk with you on the radio tomorrow. Your homework from this radio show, as of all the others, is continue to share Real Estate Coaching Radio with all your peers, especially radio shows like this. I didn't take any commercial spots. We ran it straight through because Jonathan was sharing so much powerful information. Listen to this again and again. Guys, every time I talk with Jonathan Smoke, I always feel optimistic. Hopefully you guys feel that too. There's every reason to believe that you are in the right place at the right time. Please seize that opportunity and do something about it. Start with a mindset of service, all the folks you can help, and then use this as an opportunity to better yourself and your family. So, this is the opportunity that some of you have been searching for. You're wanting to get back on your feet, recover from the housing recession, the housing crash. It's now. Your opportunity's now. I use the word opportunity maybe too much on this call, but that's truly what it is. If you need any help from us, what do? Free coaching calls for agents.com, or just go directly to our website, timandjulieharris.com. Jonathan Smoke, thank you very much for being my co-host today. And listeners, we'll talk with you on the radio tomorrow.
This program has been a presentation by Tim and Julie Harris, Real Estate Coaching. For more information on our real estate coaching and training programs, visit our website at timandjulieharris.com. Remember to tune in weekdays at noon for upcoming shows. And until next time, thank you for listening to Real Estate Coaching Radio with Tim and Julie Harris.